Hi everyone, my name is Ashley Maready and I'm the Curator of Collections and Exhibitions for the Erie Canal Museum in downtown Syracuse. The museum is currently closed in response to the COVID-19 pandemic and New York State's guidelines for non-essential businesses. So the museum is closed to the public. We've canceled or postponed until further notice all of our in-person programs and events. Even though the museum is closed, we are still working. Our full-timers are putting together information and education and history for you. And we're releasing things on our Facebook page, on our website, eriecanalmuseum.org. The reason that this video exists is because of this, and if you enjoy this video, we would be so grateful to you if you would become a member of our museum, make a tax-deductible donation to our annual fund. I'm going to put some links in the comments section for this video so that you can do that. Without further ado, though, let's get started and let's talk about some Erie Canal postcards. Let's see here. All right, so the Erie Canal Museum is home to a large number of postcards comprising all of New York State, as well as canals and waterways in other states and even in other countries. Postcards are some of my favorite items in the museum's collection, and today's talk is based on this love that I have of them. Postcards are interesting, funny, and beautiful, often all at the same time. Back at the beginning of 2018, at the museum, I staged an exhibit called Wish You Were Here, Erie Canal Postcards. To create this exhibit, I poured through the hundreds of postcards, searching to find the best ones we had, the ones with an interesting story to tell, whether the story came from the image on the front of the card or from the text written on the back of it. In some cases, it was actually both. Putting together the exhibit was some of the most fun I've had so far in my job with the Erie Canal Museum, and I'm absolutely thrilled that you guys have decided to watch this video today to hear me talk about postcards. This talk is based on the ideas expressed in the exhibit of the same name, and I'm featuring a lot of the same postcards as in the exhibit. Today we're going to journey even deeper into some of the stories from postcards. We'll start with some history of postcards themselves and move on to a general overview of the history of the Erie Canal and how the two intersected. Then we'll talk about some canal-specific history, about how the canal changed recreation, revolutionized engineering, and grew cities. We'll also talk about how canal postcards immortalized the opinions of their writers on the significance of the canal. And I'll show you some of my favorite funny slice-of-life postcards and some of my favorite images of New York canals on postcards. So just what the heck is a postcard anyway? I realize that this is probably a silly question to ask you guys. You're smart people. But postcards were not always the same as they are now. There was even some controversy at the start of their history, for they contained messages that anyone, even the servants, could read. Improper or not, they were usually cheaper to mail, and so they became very popular very quickly. The first postcards for personal mailing, rather than advertising, originated in Austria in 1869. But it was an idea whose time had come. So let's turn to the history of American postcards. The precursors of postcards in America were envelopes with pictures on them. During the Civil War in particular, patriotic images were very popular. So on June 8, 1872, the U.S. Congress authorized the creation of penny postcards, which came with postage already on them and could only be sold by the U.S. Postal Department. Postmaster General John Cresswell decreed that the recipient of the first printing contract would be the Morgan Envelope Factory of Springfield, Massachusetts. The very first penny postcard was sold in Springfield on May 12, 1873, and they went on sale everywhere the next day. On that first day, in only a few hours, over 200,000 were reportedly sold in New York City. As you can already surmise, the history of postcards is full of government regulations. The U.S. Postal Service was the only establishment allowed to arrange for their printing and to sell them until May 19, 1898, with the passage of the Private Mailing Card Act. This act allowed private companies to create postcards, which by law had to be called souvenir cards. The U.S. Postal Service may have then allowed the printing and distribution of them, but they held on to the term postcards until December 24, 1901. The look of postcards has changed over their history, also related to government regulations. By law, writing was not permitted on the back or address side of postcards until March 1, 1907. If you wanted to add a written message to a postcard, you had to write it on the front or on the image side. So here's an example of an undivided back postcard mailed in 1906 from Schenectady to Little Falls, right along the canal line. This is the front of that undivided back card. The message reads, "We went to the electric milk company, but did not see Mr. Olmsted, therefore did not get any fancy cream. We were somewhat disappointed." After the law changed, postcards began to have divided backs or a line on the address side to differentiate where the address went and where a written message could be added. These are, of course, the usual style of postcard backs you see today. And thus began the golden age of postcards, which lasted until about 1915. Postcards exploded in popularity, with over 677 million mailed in the fiscal year ending June 30th, 1908, at a time when the population of the United States was less than 89 million. Many of the very popular picture postcards being sold at the time were printed in Germany, where lithography was truly an art form. The craze for these postcards ended at the start of World War I, when the production and importation of them was disrupted by the war effort. And then the telephone came along and further killed the idea of sending a little piece of mail just to say a few words. Postcards were especially popular in the early 20th century among women in the small towns and rural areas of northern states, including New York. So from this you can surmise that postcards featuring the Erie Canal and other New York waterways were in vogue. Deltiology is the term for collecting postcards as a hobby. It is thought to be one of the three most popular collecting hobbies in the world, along with coin and stamp collecting. And it is so popular because postcards can be found about just about any subject. Among postcards, there are a few different styles that you can look for in collections of postcards about the Erie Canal specifically, and you'll see postcards from these types in this presentation. The first is white border postcards. These date from 1915 to 1930. These postcards were printed with a white border to reduce the image size and therefore the ink costs. The German printing industry was sadly not rebuilt after the end of World War I, and postcards were on their way out in popularity at this time. High tariffs also prevented a lot of other European publishers from continuing to sell their postcards in the States. So here's a white border postcard mailed in 1926 from Rochester to Sherborn, New York. Real photo postcards date from 1906 onwards. While traditionally printed postcards were on the decline after World War I, one type of postcard whose popularity soared was real photo postcards. These were printed in black and white or sepia tones. Eastman Kodak Company of Rochester created a few models of postcard cameras that had negatives that were postcard size. Some of these cameras also had a door on the back of the camera body, enabling the photographer to add a caption to the negative itself, using a small metal stylus. These postcards were real photographs, and collectors prized them. This is a really cool one from the museum's collection. This shows the barge canal opening at Waterford in May of 1915. And then here's the reverse side of that. As you can see, it is a Kodak photo postcard. Linen postcards, which date from 1930 to 1945, are not actually printed on linen itself, but instead on paper stock that has a high linen rag content. They were cheap to produce and printed using brightly colored inks. They also have a textured look and feel to them. I really like these. They're very brightly colored and eye-catching. So here's an example of a linen postcard showing Clinton Square, Syracuse, after Canal Days. This card is from the 1940s. You can see the texture even on the scan here. Photochrome postcards, in 1945 to now. These are the modern postcards. They're in color, their images closely resemble photographs. They're more commonly purchased as souvenirs these days rather than as a way to send a quick note to a friend. This is one of the newer postcards I chose for the exhibit and for this talk, and I'm happy to include it here. Yankee Hill Lock at Fort Hunter. This was mailed in 1975. So now we will turn from the history of postcards themselves to a brief history of the waterway that made New York the Empire State. Then we'll get to see how the two intersect. The canal's importance to New York and national history cannot be overstated, and it's really no surprise that the Erie Canal was documented so thoroughly in postcards. There are three iterations of New York's Erie Canal. The construction of the first original canal, now known affectionately as Clinton's Ditch, began July 4, 1817 at Rome, New York. It officially opened October 26, 1825, although individual sections were open to use as soon as they were completed. The original canal spanned the 363 miles across the state from the Hudson River to Lake Erie, and it was 4 feet deep and 40 feet across. The original canal had 83 locks. So of course I have a postcard view of Rome for you. This is a view up the canal from George Street at Rome, New York. I really love the soft colors on this one. This depicts the enlarged Erie Canal, which we'll discuss in just a moment. There were no postcards in the time of the original canal. The enlargement projects on the canal began in the 1830s and lasted until the 1860s, with the resulting larger canal in use until the early 20th century. The enlarged Erie Canal was increased to 70 feet across and 7 feet deep, and 11 locks were removed in the process, taking the total down to 72. The original and enlarged canals were movers of people and ideas, as well as financial resources such as raw materials and finished goods. Many people, especially new immigrants from Europe, traveled on the canal to the interior of the country, bringing religious movements, ideas, and their culture along with them. The canal was the information superhighway of the 19th and early 20th century. Women's suffrage, abolition, and utopianism were all ideas that traveled and spread as a result of the canal. Here's a nice view of the canal alongside the Clyde River in Lyons. This card was mailed to Newark, New York in the year 1911. The enlarged canal was closed in the early 20th century and subsequently filled in many places, including in downtown Syracuse. Erie Boulevard, which is right outside the Erie Canal Museum, was the canal. The New York Barge Canal System was constructed beginning in 1905, opening May 10, 1918. This current canal system spans 524 miles and includes 4 branches, the main Erie, along with the Cayuga-Seneca, Champlain, and Oswego canals. It makes use of natural waterways across much of the state, including the Mohawk and Oswego rivers, which have been canalized with added locks. In western New York, there aren't suitable natural waterways, so the canal sections in that part of the state are man-made, at a minimum of 120 feet across and 12 feet deep. The system has 57 locks in total. The current system sees a lot more recreational traffic than business traffic, and it is not the great mover of people and ideas the way the original and enlarged canals were. But it is still a major draw for people who live in New York as well as those around the country and around the world. So here's just a fabulous photo postcard of the Barge Canal mailed in 1918 showing Lock 24 at Baldwinsville. So we have 2 major facets of history before us, the postcard craze and New York canals. How did the 2 intersect, and what can we learn about the canal from postcards? New York's canals were not only a means of business and immigration, but also a means of recreation for state residents as well as those from away. Leisure boat travel was a big part of the canal's early business as well. Packet boats traversed the state, and the Erie Canal Navigation Company was the first company to offer this sort of experience to the public, starting as soon as the canal's middle division was completed. Their fleet of boats was painted in bright colors, and had a full complement of crew to make traveling the canal a leisure experience. It cost $6.25 to travel from Utica to Rochester in 1823, quite a bargain, which was a trip taking 2 days and 2 nights. Boats owned by various companies carried an average of 30 to 50 passengers for various distances at a cost of about 4 cents per mile. You could even just go out for a day trip. For example, if you were in Syracuse, you could leave from Clinton Square and go check out Onondaga Lake. As time went on and the canal construction progressed, many other leisure companies sprang up and prices for travel fell, so the companies could stay competitive. And here is the enlarged canal near Schenectady, New York. The canal also spurred the development of a new inland boat building industry that was very prominent in the Rochester area. Rochester was uniquely positioned to take advantage of logs floating down the Genesee River, access to lumber brought in from Lake Ontario, and skilled craftsmen in the area. Rochester creations were called fairy palaces in miniature by a Buffalo editor. Canal travel was a very romantic way to travel across New York and more pleasant than going overland, even in spite of having to duck on the upper deck to avoid smacking into the famed low bridge you might be passing under. Here is a leisure boat traveling through Port Byron on the canal. At the time that postcards were becoming a major fad, the railroads had overtaken the canal system as the primary means of cargo transport, but the canal retained its romance and the feel of the early 19th century. The golden age of postcards also coincided with the construction of the Barge Canal and the closing of the enlarged canal. The Barge Canal appears in many postcard images, but was not as romantic as the enlarged canal. Boats were no longer moved by mules and horses, and they moved faster, and parts of the state which had once had the enlarged canal, such as Syracuse, were no longer on the canal system. Postcards helped to preserve the idea of a leisurely trip across New York State. I love this one. This is Buffalo Harbor in enlarged canal days. Dear Florence, have a ride on the water with me. This is a beautiful day and too nice to stay indoors. With love, Auntie Agnes. I really hope that Florence took her up on that offer. Erie Canal also easily connected bodies of water across the state. In this case, Oneida Lake. Looks like a beautiful day for a boat ride, and you can see the very soft and lovely colors in this card too. In addition to offering opportunities for boating across the state, the canal also beckoned to swimmers for some reason. Let me state right off, this is something that makes no sense to me at all. Remember all the boating activity that we just discussed? Those boats had restrooms on board, which consisted of buckets. Users were encouraged to flush the head by dumping said buckets into the canal after use. Thousands of boats traveled on the canal every year. So you can imagine the scope of the problem here, and yet we have postcards of people swimming in the canal. The Fresh Air Club of Lyons, New York. I actually love this postcard and the next one I'm going to show you, in spite of my objections to swimming in the canal. Same group of guys out of the water. Thankfully, the canal also made more easily available trips to places that were actually good for swimming, such as Sylvan Beach. Sylvan Beach is on Oneida Lake, which had actually been bypassed on the original Erie Canal's construction. The lake was later connected to the canal system by way of the Oneida River and two smaller canals. Sylvan Beach became a center of summer fun in the last few decades of the 19th century and became the Coney Island of central New York, with the construction of hotels and amusement parks. It also appears in postcards of the early 20th century, and it was a much safer and saner site of water recreation. I've lived in New York almost 4 years now, and I have yet to visit Sylvan Beach. I should go check it out, right? Postcards also offer a look at the engineering marvels created in conjunction with the canal. In particular, the Flight of 5 locks at Lockport was an unprecedented project. As we discussed earlier, the Erie Canal was constructed in sections, with the work beginning in the Middle Division. The western end of the canal, connecting to Lake Erie, was left as the last part of the project. This was due to the challenges involved. The canal was a learn-as-you-go project for its engineers, who were not professionals, as no professional engineers or engineering schools existed at the time of construction. The Niagara Escarpment and subsequent 60-foot elevation change at Lockport, near the end of the canal route, was a major obstacle in the project, and it took the creation of a double set of 5 combined locks, one each for ascending and descending boat traffic. Nathan Roberts designed the lock system, and as a result, his name has become one of those synonymous with the engineering marvel that was the original Erie Canal. The partial boat that's in the lock tender's garden at the museum is named for him. The Lockport locks were one of the many iconic canal sites to be immortalized in postcard form, so I have 2 examples for you. First up, this one, pre-barge canal construction. This may give you some idea of our locks, writes the postcard sender at the top of this postcard. You can see that this is a pre-1907 postcard, and the message had to be on the front. The message on this one, in total: Dear cousin, we have arrived at last safe, sound, and sober in Lockport. The train was 2 hours late, but we had a jolly time on the up trip. I have a meeting on hand for this evening, but will write more later. The train reached here at 2:30 p.m. Found all well and feel fine myself. Yours, Howard B. Gill. And here is a color postcard of Lockport's locks on the barge canal. The original Flight of 5 lock chambers remain as a spillway, but the locks currently in use are numbered E34 and E35 on the current system. Lockport itself, like many other upstate towns and cities, exists as a result of the canal, as the workers who executed Robert's plan for the locks remained in the area after the canal was completed and opened. It's currently home to around 20,000 residents, and tourists come from all over the world to see the locks that made this area famous. Let's turn to another iconic canal city. Let's talk about Rochester and see some postcards of the Flower City. The showpiece of Rochester on the Erie Canal was the second Genesee River Aqueduct. The original aqueduct in Rochester was constructed from 1821 to 1823, but had leakage issues and was replaced with the second aqueduct constructed a little south of the first effort from 1836 to 1842. This aqueduct crossed the river on 7 arches of 52 feet apiece, resting on 6 piers and 2 abutments, each 10 feet thick. The arched portion of it is 444 feet long, and the whole length, including wing walls, is 800 feet. Today, this is the base of the Broad Street Bridge. The bridge came into being after construction of the current canal system, when the canal was moved south of the city. Dear Goldie, get on your bathing suit and come on. Don't swim in the canal! And here it is again, in color. This is another Rochester site. The Court Street Bridge is adjacent to the Broad Street Bridge and was constructed in 1893. Rochester was one of 7 locations on the enlarged canal system that had a waylock. Unlike the Syracuse waylock, however, Rochester's was torn down in the early 20th century. Syracuse waylock is home to the Erie Canal Museum. The Rochester waylock remains as an image in this postcard, showing the proximity of the waylock to the Genesee River Aqueduct. This is an example of the canal scenery that once existed but did not survive the March of Progress, and another reason why postcards are so valuable. The canal's 7 waylocks were very important for the operation and maintenance of the system. They were located in Rochester, of course, and Syracuse, but also in Utica, Oswego, Waterford, West Troy, and Albany. $7 million for canal construction was appropriated from the New York State Legislature to allow the initial project to be completed. This money would have to be paid back. So the canal charged tolls for usage until 1882. These tolls were collected by the 7 waylocks. A boat would enter and the water would be drained from the way chamber. A boat would settle on a wooden cradle attached to a scale by rods. The unloaded weight of the boat, which was collected and distributed to each of the waylocks at the beginning of each canal season, would be subtracted from the loaded weight and used to calculate a toll. During the operating season, the whalocks would run 24 hours a day, weighing and tolling a boat as often as every 15 minutes. The total amount amassed by the end of toll collection was over $121 million. The cost of construction for the original Erie Canal and the enlarged canal totaled over $78 million, and toll collection, superintendents, and repairs came to a little under $30 million, so the canal turned a small profit. While we're on the subject of whalelock buildings, I have to take this opportunity to show you some really neat postcards from the 1990s that the museum's operations manager found and gave me of the Erie Canal Museum. Makes me a little wistful to see these since the museum is currently closed. So the Syracuse whalelock has the distinction of being the only surviving whalelock building, and of course its look has changed, even just since the 1990s. These are all pre-Syracuse visitor centers, the addition of the new building on the east side of the original building, where you would come into the museum. This postcard shows the backyard before the addition of the lock tender's garden. And then this one is back from when we were just the Canal Museum, not even just the Erie Canal Museum. Speaking of Syracuse, iconic Clinton Square, both pre- and post-Erie Canal days, is the subject of many, many postcards. Clinton Square was the historic center of our city, serving as a market space as well as a dock area for the packet boat tours that departed from Syracuse and took passengers to nearby locations such as Onondaga Lake. So I live on the west side of the city, and it kind of blows my mind every day when I drive through Clinton Square on my way to the museum that I'm driving where the canal once flowed. This is a great postcard because it actually has the buildings labeled, so you could send this to your out-of-town friends. Got a few more pre-1907 postcards. All well as usual, and hope this will find you the same. Your friend, Cora. Dear cousin, this is a grand place. I wish you were here. Kath. A nice place for a swim. I beg to differ on this one. So since we're talking about Syracuse and the Erie Canal Museum, and I live in Syracuse, it would be remiss of me not to recount the story of a famous canal disaster that was commemorated in postcards. On July 30th, 1907, the keystone in the center arch in a stone culvert collapsed. This culvert had been constructed in 1838 and was responsible for carrying the canal over Onondaga Creek. This resulted in a huge hole at the bottom of the canal. The entire 7-mile stretch of the canal's Syracuse level gushed into Onondaga Creek. The resulting vortex of water created was so strong that 5 canal boats were sucked in and destroyed. Nearby buildings backed up to the canal also suffered damage. Of particular note was the Jacob Amos Feed and Flour Mill, whose foundation was eroded. The back wall collapsed, releasing about 500 barrels of flour into the mess caused by the break. The following day, the wall of the Greenway Brewery, which was on the towpath side of the canal, fell in as well. Thankfully, there were no injuries. This section of the canal had to be closed and drained so it could be fixed, remaining closed for almost 2 months and severely impacting the local economy. This may seem to be an odd event to be commemorated by postcard, but it was major news at the time. The culvert was repaired again just a few years ago, and it is still intact, carrying Erie Boulevard over Onondaga Creek. This postcard was written August 13th, 1907. Dear folks, this is a view of the canal before the break, and we'll get some of the others Saturday. Hope you arrive safe and sound at Freeville, and be sure to come to the fair. It is impossible to get the other views now. And it's signed Cornelia. Where the bottom fell out of the Erie Canal onto Onondaga Creek, Syracuse, New York, July 30th, 1907. Dear Julia, have you forgotten your old friend in Syracuse? May. There was even this postcard of the cleanup effort with the wrecked boats being burned. There's no other way to get rid of them. In addition to teaching us history, postcards are also an excellent way to assess opinions of and travelers' experiences on New York canals. Here's the Erie Canal at Schenectady, Rexford Flats. The backside. The perils of canal travel. This card was sent in 1911. Dear folks, we forgot to tell you that when we got on the boat to come to Albany, they told us we might get stuck in the mud, and we did. They had to get a tug to pull us out, and we didn't get in Albany till 9:30. It's a good thing we had a lunch with us. It's a photo postcard of Baldwinsville. I'm up here for a week, having a big time. The barge runs through the Seneca River for quite a distance, and I have seen quite some engineering. The river is very pretty, and between the canal and motorboat, I'm having some great trips. Lots of scenery and water lilies. You'd better come up and get a job on the barge. And here is the Oswego Canal, one of the major tributary branches of the canal system. This is Phoenix, New York. Dear Edith, I'm sitting in the car outside the bank waiting for May and looking right over this canal. Not at all beautiful, but very useful. It's nice to be home. Love, Ben. This one is from July 29th, 1946, so a bit more modern than a lot of what you've seen. How would you like to be there? We also have some very funny postcards in our collection, and the time has come for you to get to check out some of them. This is Main Street looking south at Amber, New York, on Otisco Lake. Still sober, Scotty and I are now in this busy street, dodging the crowd. This card was mailed in 1913. This is a gorgeous image on this one, Casanova. Then you flip it over and you get a very miffed message. Now really, what has become of you? I wrote you some time ago, but I'm still waiting to know if you know how to write the English language. Had to come here today for dental work, going down home until Sunday p.m. Mailed in 1909. This is Middle Lock on the Erie Canal at Newark, New York. Dear old pal, just a line to let you know I am not dead but sleeping. Sent in 1909. And we end up back at Clinton Square. Are you still on the face of the earth? I haven't heard from you lately. Father feeling pretty good. And last but not least, I want to show you some of my favorite postcard images. I like these because of the scenery and the history behind the pictures. So here we have a photo postcard of Lock 52 in Port Byron. The site is now the home of the Port Byron Old Erie Canal Heritage Park, which allows visitors to check out the remains of Lock 52, along with the Erie House Tavern, a canal-side business from 1895. They also have a nice visitor center, and they began opening seasonally in 2016. They're right on the I-90 thruway, so check it out the next time you're in the area after this crisis has passed. It was created and is managed by our friends with the Canal Society of New York State. This card is Owasco's Angry Waters near Auburn. Owasco is the 6th largest of the Finger Lakes and was a noted vacation destination for the wealthy in the 19th century. I just love this one so much. The soft colors of the boats are just gorgeous. Buffalo is, of course, another city that wouldn't exist if not for the Erie Canal. Oswego River and Lock 7 on the Oswego Canal. I also have a soft spot for Oswego and the Oswego Canal. And on that note, I hope I've made you a fan of postcards if you weren't already. I can only assume you were already a fan of the Erie Canal since you watched this video. Thanks for listening. Again, the Erie Canal Museum is closed right now due to the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020. Please consider supporting the museum financially at this time so we can continue our work and reopen when the crisis has passed. Like I said earlier in the video, I'm going to drop some links below for you to donate money or become a member of the museum. Again, thank you very much for watching, and I hope you're staying healthy. Take care.